Alright, so this is part 2 in the chop series for the Madrid Build-A-Board. So if you haven't seen the shaping episode, check that guy out. Now, chopping boards can be pretty intimidating. You know, you feel like you invested the money in the board, and now you're going to chop it into bits, and, you know, it feels very intimidating because you might mess up and it might turn out bad, and it is what it is. You got to go ahead and risk it for the biscuit when you're doing the chop. I say go for it. One of the major factors that limits people in chopping boards is tools. And honestly, yeah, there's a pretty high cost when it comes to a lot of tools, especially if you go the power tool route. Now, you can do a chop with hand tools. You can do it with, a palm sander. You just, you buy, and, you could probably do it with a hand saw. It's going to take a long time, and it might not be the cleanest finish, but you can make it look pretty good with just simple hand tools that don't cost much. Check the thrift store. They got the cheap tools. Now, I use power tools in this one because they're just tools that I already have. I mean, I don't use hand tools in this video, but you could do it. It's possible. Alright, so let's get started. The first step when you're doing a chop is to get the rough cut. So you've already drawn out the outline of the board. Make sure you did it in Sharpie, because this is where that really counts, that it's a really clear, permanent finish, that Sharpie. So as you can see, I'm using a jigsaw. It's a very thin blade that is able to turn corners, and that's why it's able to turn corners, is because it is such a thin blade. Now, while it is able to turn corners, do not try and make sharp corners when you are using a jigsaw. If you're trying to turn 90 degrees, it just won't work. Do soft angles with the jigsaw, and if there is a hard angle of, over like 60 degrees or something like that, then just run the jigsaw all the way to the edge and just go right off the board, and then just start a new cut later. Do not cut straight along the line that you drew, because if you mess up and you cut too deep in, you can't go back. It's already cut. And 2, there's another part of the shaping process that's coming up that's going to take those last 2 to 3 millimeters off. So like I said, go about 2 to 3 millimeters outside of your outline line of what your final shape is going to be. Last thing with the jigsaw is try to keep the jigsaw not necessarily flat right to the board, because the concave turns the edges up and you're going to end up with rails that are kind of at a wonky angle, and you're going to see the top shape when you look at the board from the top is going to be different than the shape you're looking at from the underside, and it's very unsatisfying and bad to look at. So try and keep the blade perpendicular to the ground, not necessarily to where the board is. The next step is to finish the shaping process, actually cutting out to that black Sharpie line with a sander. Now, I use a belt sander in this one because it's really powerful. It takes a lot of material off, especially when you use a pretty low grit sandpaper. I want to say I used an 80 grit. I would actually prefer a 60 grit in this case because it just goes so much faster, but 60 to 80 is fine. Something I didn't do in this is to place your sander upside down in a vice grip. It's like the best way to do it, and then you just run the board along that. My sander's just too wide, it won't fit in my vice grip. It's just an awkward fit, it doesn't hold itself, whatever. You don't have to do it either. When you're making passes over the rails with that belt sander, you are going to want to make them really gradual and even passes. You don't want to sit with the sander in one area because you're going to end up with kind of wavy looking rails. You want them to be as straight and even lined as possible. When you get to areas where you're sanding, like especially the nose and the tail, where the actual sander is hitting less surface area versus like one of the rails where probably the entire piece of sandpaper is going to be touching, when you get to those small surface areas, they are going to go so much faster. So just be wary that when you start to sand those areas by the nose and tail, you're probably going to wear down really fast. Once you've actually got the actual shape out, it's very satisfying to see. You can actually see what the shape is going to finally look like. Then you're going to go ahead and start rounding the rails. Now, this is a downhill board, so the top rails are going to stay really sharp. You could do something different with the tail, but we'll talk about the tail later. You are just going to basically be sanding the underside rails. And you want to do this because every time that your board hits something and you have a sharp rail, it's going to splinter way more easily when it is not rounded. Obviously, you want to keep that sharp rail on top with some grip, but the underside should definitely be rounded. I switched over to an orbital sander. It's just a lot easier to handle. It's very light, in hand, and I used a 120 grit, which is not going to take a huge amount of material off and is going to look pretty smooth in its finish. Could be smoother for sure, but 120 is pretty nice looking. Again, I want to make gradual passes, but since this time I'm rounding the rails, I want to start at a basically flat to the rail. Then I'm going to go passes at a slight angle, and I'm just going to do this like 6 or 7 times until it ends up just looking like a overall rounded shape. Just doing gradual passes at as even of an angle as you can. Try to keep it the same angle as you make those passes. It's very difficult to do, but you know, that's how it's going to look good. Now, I said this earlier, but the tail, you could round the top edge. It's very unlikely that you're going to need a bunch of grip from the top rail of the kicktail. You're not probably going to put your foot there when you're trying to grip something. But this will be nice because the board's going to probably flip at times, and because of that, the top area is just going to like explode more or less if it's a sharp rail. I didn't round mine, but you could, and I could have too. I didn't, so we'll see how that affects the longevity of the tail, but yeah, probably round the top level too. Next up, we've got drilling the mounting holes. Now, drilling mounting holes is it's a very basic thing that people do all the time to re-drill a board. It's a early modification people do, and it's honestly a very difficult one because you have to get your holes, all 8 of them, extremely precise. Start by measuring it out with a spare base plate you have, but double check by actually measuring the distance between all of the holes and making sure they are correct to make sure that they are right. Because if you're off a little bit, then it's very difficult to fix your mistake. A huge helpful tool that I have found when it comes to doing a re-drill is using a thing called a scratch awl. It looks like a little screwdriver, but like it's just got a poker at the end of it. And what I do with this is I will take the scratch awl and I will mark the spots that I want to drill, because sometimes what'll happen is you'll go to re-drill with just a bit and you'll go to where your marking was, and because the drill bit spins as it is used, it will sometimes be in place, but then that spinning right at the beginning will slightly put it off, and that's just enough to mess up the entire hole. So use that scratch awl, because that's going to make the drill bit not move, and it's going to make sure that it stays in that exact spot when it's drilling in. Before you actually drill through the board, make sure you're always drilling from the underside of the deck. It really isn't that important if the holes on the top side of the deck are completely precise, but it is very important that they match up with the base plate holes on the underside of the deck. Mount a 2x4 to the top side of the deck, and what that's going to do is it is going to take the drill bit as it goes through the board, and if that 2x4 is not there, then that top ply is going to get all splintered and chipped where the drill bit eventually presses through. Alright, now we're getting into the fancy stuff. What we have next is doing flush mounts. Now, flush mounts are not something you have to do. I like to do them in a lot of my boards because I like things to be overall a little more slidey than they are grippy, but let's talk flush mounts. The purpose of a flush mount is just to have the entire board sit a little bit lower. The trucks actually sit physically into the board. Now, plies wise, you probably don't want to go any further than 2 to 3 plies into a board, depending on, how many plies it is. This one's 8 plies, so I would say 2 to 3 plies leaves you with, 5 or 6 plies. And that's probably going to be fine structurally, but if you start going to, 4 plies left, 3 plies left, you're going to have problems. Going back to the purpose, it is going to be easier to push on this because it's lower. It's going to be easier to slide because the, center of gravity is lower as well. It is going to be a little less durable because, there's less material there, and it's going to be a little bit less grippy. So if you are making a race board where you want to have as much grip as possible, then don't put flush mounts into the board unless you're just trying to level something out, which is a lot harder to install a flush mount like that. I don't know how to do that. It's also worth noting that a flush mount is going to make your wheels sit closer to the board, so you're going to have less wheel clearance. I'm probably not going to be mounting big wheels. Most of the wheels I'm going to be mounting are 70 mil or under, so, flush mounts sounds good to me. Now, you can do a flush mount with a chisel and a hammer. It's possible. It's like the hand tool route, and it's way cheap. It takes a super long time to do. I've done it a lot of times before I had a router, but I have a router. The only thing that's worth noting is that the router, when you get to the corners, a router is a circular bit. So it's a spinning circular bit, so it can't make actual 90-degree 90-degree corners, it can only make, rounded edges. So I wanted my flush mounts to have straight 90-degree edges. So what I did is I routed out all of the inner material, and as soon as I got to those corners, I just finished them off by using a chisel, plunging down into it, and then cutting out from there. Also, when you start the actual routing process of drilling in, what you want to do is you want to turn the router on without it touching the wood. Then you want to sit the edge of the router, the actual plate, at an angle, and then slowly let the actual rotating blade go in, and just keep on letting it slowly go on its own into the wood until it is completely level. Routers are super dangerous. They spin really fast and they can completely torch you if you mess up. So be careful with routers. All right, finally we're on to the last step, which is the wheel wells. Wheel wells can easily go very wrong. They won't ruin your board or anything, but they can look really awful if they're not symmetrical. And symmetry is very difficult in any level, so having symmetry here, definitely a difficult thing to make happen. Now there's two different types of wheel wells. You can do a routed wheel well, where it just kind of takes an even amount of material out, and they look really sick. But on the other hand, while they do look really cool, they're taking off a lot of material, which is going to decrease the durability, and it's also going to actually increase a little bit of flex characteristics in those areas. I'm going with a belt sander approach instead, which is taking off less material. Definitely doesn't look as cool, but is going to make it more durable and a little bit stiffer, snappier overall board. So the steps to this are to mount an actual truck on the board. The trucks preferably that you're going to use, you're going to remove the roadside bushing from there so that you can put it at full lean, and then you're going to want to put a wheel actually on the truck to simulate that full lean. Try to get it to be a wheel that is like the biggest wheel you're going to use, and also a pretty wide wheel to kind of figure out how far in the wheel well should go. Once you got those trucks at full tilt, then you're going to want to mark that outer edge, kind of where the wheel actually meets the board. Once you've got that, you kind of want to follow the truck line and mark the inner area pretty much where I had marked that flush mount. Then line the two of those up, and that's pretty much your sanding mark. Decide how deep you want it to go in, and get sanding with the belt sander. As you sand, start really, really slow. Pretty much just kind of make a small divot in there with the belt sander just to make sure that you're starting it at the right spot. Once you've checked that you've got the right spot, then you can kind of start to just evenly let it sink in. It's so important that you get it correct on the first touchdown with the sander, because your sander is always going to want to go back to wherever the deepest area is already. So it will kind of stay locked in once you get it started, but you got to get it kind of straight onto that line from the start. Keep track of the depth you go when you're going into the board. I think I want to say I went like 4 plies deep, which is, half the depth of the board. So you want to leave at least 3 plies on the top sheet. I only went 4 plies deep just to get, a little bit more meat, because inevitably there's a kicktail on this board, so the board's going to probably flip onto its top rails more often than most boards, so you want to have a little extra meat there. Try to keep those wheel wells as symmetrical as possible. It's very difficult to get it exactly correct doing them completely by hand, but it'll be pretty noticeable if they're pretty off of each other, so try your best to keep them very, very even. That's pretty much the chop process. So in the next video, we're going to talk about sealing it up, making sure it's waterproof, and as well as painting it.